Welcome to the IISS this afternoon. My name is Rahul Roy Chaudhary. I'm the Senior Fellow for South Asia at the Institute. Today's discussion on India and the US, friends, foes, or natural allies, could not be more timely. A few minutes ago, US Secretary of State Mike Pompeo formally announced the reimposition of sanctions on Iran, including on countries dealing with Iran. India is now formally one of 8 countries granted a temporary waiver from sanctions in response to specific circumstances on the basis, presumably, that India will substantially at some stage cut its import of oil from Iran. However, this will be, I think, difficult to carry out. There is also the related concern that persists in India over the possibility of shipping and banking sanctions by the US in relation to its development of Iran's Chabahar port to ensure seaborne and road connectivity for Afghanistan's stability and security. And of course, the impact on US policy of India's prospective acquisition of S-400 surface-to-air missiles from Russia. It is therefore important today to discuss the prospects and challenges of India's relations with the US, which also takes place within weeks of the first of the new 2+2 structured dialogue format among India and US foreign and defense ministers that took place in India recently. We are fortunate to have today Ambassador Arun Singh to guide us through the complexities and nuances of India's relations with the US, India's most important bilateral relationship and top strategic partner. Ambassador Arun Singh is a distinguished visiting senior fellow at the IISS. He served as India's ambassador to the United States from 2015 to 2016 and as India's deputy chief of mission in Washington, D.C. from October 2008 to April 2013. He has also served as ambassador of India to France in 2013-2015 and importantly from India's perspective as ambassador of India to Israel from 2005 to 2008. Sir, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you, Rahul. Thank you for the introduction and also a very generous description of the work I have done. And a lot of people have tried to figure out where the India-US relationship lies. How does one describe it? It's not an alliance. And in India, it's clear that they're not looking for alliances of any kind because India says that it wants to maintain the strategic autonomy of its decision-making. And therefore, an alliance kind of relationship, especially a military alliance, is not something that you're looking for. And I recall that some years ago, the Council of Foreign Relations did a major study. And they also struggled with how do you define this relationship. And I think it was in 2012. And they came out with the formulation saying it's a joint venture. That where you find convergence of interests, you work together, and where there is no defined convergence of interests, you don't get into the production of those commodities. You stay away from that. So that was one way of describing it. And I think Rahul touched upon some of the challenges that are there in the relationship. For example, on Iran. There was a lot of uncertainty, especially in the policy community, as to how the US moving away from JCPOA and the sanctions that would follow would impact on India. And I think in India, if you saw the writing emanating from there or any comments there was a fair measure of confidence that India would get the exemption and waiver from the sanctions. And the reason for that is that, one, while India's formal position is that we do not accept unilateral sanctions, India accepts only sanctions that come through the United Nations framework. And therefore, we cannot say that we will take actions in keeping with unilateral US sanctions. But the way the international trade develops, that once US sanctions start coming into effect, financial transactions are not possible. Therefore, you cannot pay for Iranian oil in US dollars. Earlier, when US dollar payments were not possible, payments were being done through euros as authorized by the United States. But now with the difficulties in the US-European relationship related to Iran, the availability of euros for payments would be very limited. In the earlier round of sanctions in 2012 to 2015, the US had also authorized some payments to done through the Turkish Halk Bank. But a short while ago, the Turkish Halk Bank had been sanctioned. Therefore, the ability to do any payments through the Halk Bank would also become difficult. Therefore, the physical capacity to make payments for any imports of Iranian oil would be challenged. And a certain amount of payments you can do in rupees. But there the problem was, as was evidenced in 2012-2015 period before JCPOA had come into effect, is that while Iran bought a lot from China, South Korea and Japan, and therefore bilateral payment arrangement with those countries did not lead to huge balances accumulating. In the Indian case, Iran was not buying very much from India. So for all the oil purchases that were done in rupees, there was an accumulation of rupee reserves in India, which eventually India was able to bring down only when the JCPOA had come into effect and the sanctions on Iran were removed. And also with the sanctions coming into effect, global insurance dries up. With the sanctions coming into effect, global shipping dries up. So even if India would not want formally to reduce oil imports from Iran, in reality oil imports would come down. And so long as you're doing significant reductions in oil imports, you qualify for waiver from sanctions. And the only difference this time is that in the 2012-2015 period, the Obama administration had signaled clearly that if you did 20% reduction every 6 months, you would be eligible for waivers. This time, the Trump administration, perhaps because they want to play hardball with countries, have not clearly specified what they mean by significant reduction. But they've said we want this to go towards zero. But what does towards zero mean? How much should you reduce every 6 months? All that has not been quantified. But I think countries that still need Iranian oil because of their energy security requirements, and also nobody in the world wants the oil prices to spike, especially at this time of global uncertainty, so long as a certain amount of reduction can be seen as significant reduction, countries would qualify for waivers. And that's how I think India, along with 7 other countries, has now been granted the waiver. The second challenge, perhaps even more significant, would be on CATSA. The purchase of what has India has announced of the S-400 missile defense system from Russia. And again, it is clear that India has no option but to move positively with its defense cooperation relationship with Russia. It's a very important legacy relationship. In terms of our defense inventory, more than 60% of the defense inventory is of Russian origin. The Russian relationship remains important for India for political reasons, as well as for maintaining its defense preparedness. And therefore, India, again, because that relationship is important, went ahead with the decision to move with purchase of S-400, which was announced when President Putin visited India recently. Now the US has to decide how to deal with this, because under US legislation, which, as those of you who have been studying it know, is really a product of US domestic politics, because of the way how the elections of 2016 were perceived. And therefore, in the US Congress, there was a move to take certain steps, actions against Russia, in their perception related to the conduct of the elections, in their perception related to possible impact of the way the elections were done on the outcome. So Congress has moved to impose those sanctions, which the administration clearly was not very comfortable with, but they have to deal with the sanctions as they are under law. But there are 2 significant provisions. One, that the country has to show that it is reducing its dependence on Russia. Now that's something India clearly cannot show. And second, that it is in US interest not to sanction that country, or the US relationship with that country is moving in a certain direction. And today, my judgment would be that it is in US interest not to sanction India. Because if US were to sanction India in any way at a time when the US-India relationship is moving in a very, very positive trajectory, it would signal to people in India that US is not a reliable partner. And it is not in US interest to be seen as a non-reliable partner in India when the relationship, including in defense, is moving very positively. You would have seen recently that in 2016, again for the very reason that in the US they are not able to put India in any neat category. Where is that relationship? It's not an ally, it's not a NATO partner. How do you define the relationship? And for all kinds of clearances, approvals, you need to put them in some category. So in 2016, the US administration declared India as a major defense partner. That was one way to signal to legislative bodies as well as to bureaucracy in the US that any approvals related to India must be looked at in a certain framework and context. And recently, following from the major defense partner status, the US has given India a STA-1 authorization, Strategic Trade Authorization Level 1, for technology releases, which is the same level as the releases available to NATO partners and the closest partners of the United States. So which again is a signal of the direction in which the relationship is headed. Looking at the past, so if we are to try to see that going ahead, how will the US-India relationship evolve? So putting it in context, I have found that 4 factors have over time influenced the US-India relationship. And if we look at those 4, one can safely sort of anticipate which way the relationship will develop. First is, how does the US define its role in the global context? What are its global priorities and interests? Based on that, of course, where does the relationship with India fit in? Second, given that global context, how does it define its relationship with Pakistan? Because again, that will have an impact on the relationship with India. Third, given its global priorities, how does it define its relationship with China? That again will have an impact in India. And fourth, what are the dimensions of the bilateral relationship? So, and I'll just briefly touch upon these aspects to justify the point I'm making. Not many people realize that during the Second World War, there were 250,000 US troops present in India, in the northeastern part of India, to support the British war effort, again in support of China, nationalist China, and against Japan. And at that time, the US pushed for independence of India, because they felt that as part of the new global role, as part of the effort in the context of the Second World War, their assessment was that a free and independent India would contribute far more to the war effort as against an India that was colonized, and where the leaders of India's movement of national independence had given a call for the British to quit India because they had declared war on behalf of India without consulting the leadership of India. So at that time, the US came out and pushed Britain to grant independence for India. But when the then British Prime Minister Winston Churchill opposed it strongly, as you know, his famous statements that over my dead body, or I have not been made the Majesty's First Minister to preside over dismemberment of the British Empire. When he resisted very strongly, the US did not push beyond a point because they didn't want to disrupt the alliance in the context of the Second World War. So, and once India became independent, in the beginning when the Kashmir issue came up in 1947, when there was a tribal invasion from Pakistan, the US came out in support of India's position. And they said this is the post-Second World War world. An invasion has happened, which is not acceptable on principles, and India has to be supported. And then archives will tell you that the British leadership, their ambassador in US, the foreign secretary and others went to the US and said, please change your position. These Indians are too large, too big a country. They are independent minded. See what they've done to us. They've decolonized the subcontinent. Now they're trying to decolonize the rest of the world. Pakistan is much smaller. It will remain dependent on us. It will give us military bases. It will be an ally. Let us support Pakistan in the context of Kashmir. And US, UK at the UN changed the position on Kashmir to support Pakistan, again looking at the role that Pakistan will play in terms of their global interests, and that starts complicating the US relationship with India. In the context of the Cold War that emerged after the Second World War, the US started setting up military bases all over the world. And India, which had just become independent, did not want again to get involved in any kind of a dependence on external powers, declared the policy of non-alignment, staying away from other power blocs. But Pakistan offered itself as an ally, a military ally, and therefore the huge amounts of military supplies going from the US to Pakistan, which complicates the relationship with India. So this, I'm just as one set of global sort of priorities that the US sets for itself, which start impacting on the India relationship. Similarly, if you look at the context of China, after India's independence, for a long time, US leaders saw India, a democratic India, as presenting a different model of development compared to the model that was coming from China. And therefore, there was tremendous support for the Indian economic effort. President Kennedy, in 1959, when he was Senator Kennedy, made a major speech in the Senate focusing entirely on India. And that became an important plank for his presidency. That a developing country like India, which was democratic, must be supported in its economic transformation as a message to other developing countries. In 1962, when India had the conflict with China, it was the United States which supported India with huge amount of military supplies to enable it to meet the challenge from China. The complication came in 1965 when India had a conflict with Pakistan and the US did not want to supply arms to either Pakistan, which was a military ally, or India, which was an important partner in the context of China, held back on supplies from both, and in India it was seen as an unreliable partner. And then we have 1971. In 1971, when the crisis between India and Pakistan was developing, you would recall that Henry Kissinger made a secret visit to China to do the opening from US to China to sharpen the Sino-Soviet split as part of the global balance of power. And so his visit to China had been facilitated by and through Pakistan, because he was visiting Pakistan. It was declared that he had fallen sick, was not in public view, and then made a quick trip to China and came back before it was announced. So at that time, as Kissinger's memoirs also show, that as the crisis was developing between India and Pakistan, Kissinger and Nixon wanted to show to China that they stood by their allies and they would never let their allies down. So that this China, which was now looking for a new structure in the global power balance vis-a-vis the Soviet Union, should be confident of the new emerging relationship with the United States. And in that framework, therefore, US came out completely on the side of Pakistan in the 1971 conflict, even sent the 7th Fleet into the Bay of Bengal as a way of trying to pressurize India at that time. Even though within the US establishment there was division of opinion, in the State Department there was opposition to the Kissinger-Nixon policies, the US Congress was very critical of what was happening, but they stood by that. So if we really keep these factors in mind, then the question is today, where does the US-India relationship stand? So if you look at the 2+2 that Rahul referred to, which was held in September, a very important part of the joint statement talks about the Indo-Pacific. And this is a new term that has come into vogue. The US, for example, had the Pacific Command located in Hawaii, basically in terms of their military assessment and activity looking at the region from the west coast of India to the west coast of the United States. And they have only recently given it a new nomenclature of the Indo-Pacific Command as a signal that they see India very much a part of their strategic thinking related to the Bay of Bengal and the Western Pacific. And that in this region, which now they no longer call the Asia Pacific but the Indo-Pacific, their relationship with India is a very critical dimension. So as the relationship with China takes on increasingly a nature of an economic, military, political competition, because there will certainly be a lot of cooperation between the US and China. There is deep interlinkage. The trade is of the level of $500 billion, and which is significant. There are trillions, more than $1 trillion worth of Chinese investment in US securities. So there's a deep economic linkage, but there's now also an assessment of strategic competition, military competition, technological competition. In the US, restrictions are being placed through CFIUS, the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States, on Chinese acquisitions of technology. So they are entering a new phase of competition. And as that will inevitably get some focus in the US perception, the relationship with India will take on a certain salience. As far as India is concerned, the relationship with Russia is extremely important for defense, energy. Relationship with Japan is again very, very important. The Indian Prime Minister was in Japan recently. Japan is seen as a strategic partner. Japan has agreed to support the $15 billion bullet train project in India with assistance available for 50 years, 0.5% rate of interest, 15-year no repayment, again reflecting how the relationship is looked at. But if I were to look at what one could say comprehensive national interest, our largest trading partner is the United States. US remains the largest source of investment into India. Indian companies have invested over the last 5 years $20 billion in the US economy, creating more than 100,000 jobs directly, and of course there's indirect job creation impact. More than 200,000 Indian students are studying in US universities, more than the number that goes to any country. These 200,000 Indian students in US universities are paying $10 billion directly just as tuition fees. Because multiply 200,000 by 50,000, that's the figure you get, which shows up in trade statistics. Then their expenditure on staying there and other aspects. US today is the largest single country host of the Indian origin diaspora community, strength of about 4 million people. And it's a growing number. There are more than 110,000 Indian origin doctors in the US. 1 out of 7 patients today is seen by an Indian origin doctor. 40% of all hotel rooms in the United States are owned by Indian Americans, generating $13 billion of revenue, huge amount of taxes. And the figure is 60% if you take the middle and lower segment. The largest number of military exercises that the US does outside NATO, it is with India. The largest number of military exercises that India does with any country, bilateral, it is with the United States. We also have the trilateral Malabar series of exercises, increasing in complexity between India, United States and Japan. Till 2008, India had not bought any defense supplies from the United States. Between 2008 and now, they have bought almost $16 billion worth of defense supplies from the United States, reflecting a growing level of confidence between the two countries and on both sides. So going ahead, I would feel that there will be difficulties, there will be challenges. US as a global power will have global interests. It will take decisions based on its own domestic politics. It will take decisions based on its own interests, and it will not always coincide with what is in India's interest. Similarly, India, which wants to maintain the strategic autonomy of its decision making, will make its own assessments, and therefore on many issues the decisions India will take will not converge with decisions that the United States takes or would like others to take. But so long as leaders and policymakers in both countries understand that there is growing convergence, but there cannot be 100% agreement on all issues, and that the two countries have a different historical experience, different geopolitical locations, but there is sufficient convergence to have a productive joint venture, I think the positive trend in the relationship will be sustained. So let me stop here.
Thank you very much, Ambassador, for those fascinating remarks and insights. Let me begin the discussion session by focusing on one aspect of what you talked about and sort of really asking you to step back a bit. And you mentioned very clearly the positive trajectory between India and the US. $16 billion of arms sales agreement supplies in the last decade, which we'd never seen previously in that sense. But I remember a time not so long ago where the Indian security establishment had, I think, sort of a knee-jerk reaction against the United States, where there were concerns over. You mentioned, I think, partly the U.S. relation with Pakistan. That was acutely felt within the Indian strategic community. 1971, the whole business of the U.S. Aircraft carrier in the Bay of Bengal, etc., etc. But the question I wanted to ask you, and if you sort of step back a bit and seek to respond, it is, how is this perception that the Indian security establishment had, very strongly held perception, how has it been overcome? How has it been overridden? How has it changed now to what you talked about as a positive trajectory? Because in a way, I've seen that change take place over the last few years, and it's an amazing change. I mean, one would not have thought it was possible.
So I think the change has started since about 1998. Today, if you see, India has 4 major defense partners: Russia, France, Israel, and the United States. The other 3 partners, Russia, France, and Israel, are seen in India as tried and tested partners. They have stood by India at moments of crisis, and there is a certain confidence in that relationship. With the US, the transformation started in 1998. Because if you recall, in 1998, we did our nuclear tests. And the US criticized India and again led the world into imposing sanctions on India. But at the same time, they got into a very deep dialogue with India. And there was a series of talks between Strobe Talbot, the then Deputy Secretary of State in the US, and Mr. Jaswant Singh, who was first the Deputy Chairman, Planning Commission, then the Foreign Minister of India. They met 14 times in 10 countries over a period of a year and a half. There was no outcome specifically coming from those meetings, but those meetings completely transformed the relationship because they had very, very deep discussions on how each saw the challenges, perceptions, possibilities. And as that progressed, President Clinton visited India in 2000. And those who would have seen reports of that visit, a very, very transformational visit, very warmly welcomed in India despite the difficulties in 1998, and his signaling that he saw India as a major partner of the United States. The next big breakthrough came with President Bush, which again shows that there is bipartisan support in the US in terms of advancing the India relationship. So President Clinton, Democratic, President Bush, Republican. And in 2008, a process that was started in 2005, but in 2008, India and the United States signed a civil nuclear cooperation agreement. And it is very significant because in 1974, when India had done its first nuclear test, it was the United States which had led the world to create technology denial regimes, especially targeting India, to prevent flows of certain kinds of technologies to India. Between 2005 and 2008, culminating in 2008, it was the United States which led the world to create an exception just for India from the technology denial regimes it had created to target India. So that was a signal to people in India that the US is now looking at India differently. It sees the relationship in a different context, and the US had by then assessed that India was a responsible global player. It was a responsible stakeholder in the context of the nuclear issue and nuclear non-proliferation issue, and therefore should take the relationship with India in a different dimension. Also, the US assessed that if it wanted to advance the relationship with India, it had to break the logjam on civil nuclear cooperation. Because unless you permitted civil nuclear cooperation to happen, the technology releases in other areas would not be possible. And once civil nuclear cooperation was possible after 2008, technology denial related to India step by step withered away. That enabled higher levels of technology partnership in defense, because why would we buy from the United States if you are getting it elsewhere? But now US was able to offer to India levels of technology not available earlier. And so that started strengthening the partnership. And again in 1999, when we had the conflict with Pakistan in Kargil, the US was seen as taking is what I should say, a non-biased assessment of the situation, and basically putting pressure on Pakistan to step back from the incursion that it had done, violating the line of control between India and Pakistan. So with that, then the Civil Nuclear Cooperation Agreement, and then President Bush, President Obama, again a Democratic president, the first US president in history to have visited India twice in his tenure. So before President Obama went in 2010, President Bush went in 2006, President Clinton in 2000, and before that, President Carter in 1978. So you can already see that this is a signaling about how the administration is looking at the relationship with India. President Obama went in 2006, he went in, 2010, he went again in 2016 as chief guest on our Republic Day, which is a very important day for India. That's when, India rolls out its military systems, the weapons are on display, big national day. And although India is democratic, no US president had ever gone to India on our Republic Day, and President Obama was the first US president to go. He changed the date of the State of Union address to be able to visit India in 2016, again reflecting how US saw the relationship with India. And then President Obama declared India as a major defense partner, declared support for India's permanent membership of UN Security Council, again the first US president to have done that. And under President Trump also, although there have been some frictions related to the economic issues, and the two sides are discussing those issues, the Indian Prime Minister was among the first leaders he spoke to after his election, among the first leaders he spoke to after his inauguration. Indian Prime Minister was invited to visit US in June 2017, and a very, very successful visit. That's when they declared that they would now start the 2+2 dialogue at the level of foreign ministers, which we didn't have with any country. Earlier we had a 2+2 dialogue with Japan, but that was at the top bureaucratic level, not the ministerial level. So this is the first time that with any country, India has agreed to do a dialogue combining the foreign and defense at the ministerial level. And now, of course, we are looking at other options. And then the 2+2 had a very, very successful outcome. And again, in terms of releases of defense technology, one can see that the US is willing to do more and more. In 2016, India had signed the Logistics Support Agreement called LMOA, Logistics Exchange Memorandum of Agreement with the United States. And only recently, India has signed what is called the COMCASA, related to security of communication equipment, which it had been reluctant to do for a long, long time. Again, one, reflecting a higher level of confidence, and second, that now more advanced technologies would be available from the US to India in the area of defense. So I think all these reflect the evolution of the relationship, and that there is a growing confidence in India in this relationship in a long-term orientation.
Thank you. So no going back, obviously. But let me open the floor for discussion. If you want to question, comment, okay. Yes, Desmond Bowen.
Desmond Bowen, I'm a member. I've got a couple of questions. You speak very positively about this developing relation, or maybe it's a developed relationship, and yet at the same time, the US is demonstrating itself to be a completely unreliable partner in all sorts of other fields, whether it's in relation to JCPOA, in relation to NATO, a whole range of demonstrations of America sort of, speaking well in one moment, but then resiling and moving in a different direction. I mean, I just wondered whether you'd sort of comment upon the extent to which India can really put its trust in that long-term relationship. I mean, particularly if India doesn't reduce, for example, its imports of Iranian oil at a level that maybe the US might seek. And secondly, I wonder if you could comment on the sort of Indian view of the disintegrating world order. I mean, I've heard it said in India that actually it's a good thing that this Washington consensus and this post-World War II settlement, which was largely a Western and maybe an American construct, actually is beginning to disintegrate, or has disintegrated, and the extent to which that's an opportunity for India, maybe particularly in relation to the UN, but more generally, whether that's something to be desired and whether it's something that they could work with India, with the US on.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. So on the unreliability dimension, so there I'd say a couple of things. First, as you can see, there is now a bipartisan support in the US for the India relationship. In today's context, perhaps even more than for Israel. There was a time when Israel was the sort of the model of a bipartisan support, and so India, both from Republicans, Democrats, there is support for this relationship. When I was ambassador there and the election campaign was on, and there was tremendous rhetoric, some of which is now playing out in the context of the campaign, the values of allies being questioned, the expenditure on allies. So the point I used to make is that we are not an ally. You are not spending anything in India. You have no military bases in India. There is no subsidy being given to India. We are not asking for a partnership based on subsidy or alliances. All we are saying is partner economically, partner technologically, strengthen India, and a stronger India is in US interest. And therefore, we are an ideal partner for the United States. But that's, of course, responding to the campaign rhetoric. So I think the unreliability, that unpredictability that you see right now, the questions are being asked about nature of alliances, commitment on alliances, expenditure on alliances. India has not posed a cost to the US, and I think there is a recognition in the US that a stronger India is in US interest, given the global context. Under the Obama administration, the US leaders had articulated repeatedly that we fully embrace the rise of India. We see India as a net security provider, and that we believe that a stronger India will contribute to stability. I also would like to draw attention to the statement made by the then US Secretary of State Tillerson in the Trump administration on 16th October last year, before his visit to India, where in his major speech at CSIS, largely focused on India, there's one sentence where he said, security concerns of India are US security concerns. And short of an alliance, I think that's a very, very important and significant statement. So we have to understand that clearly there is a ferment happening globally. Clearly there is a ferment happening in the United States. The kind of world order that the US had tried to work for post-World War II, and especially after 1990, after the dissolution of the Soviet Union. And the US benefited, a certain section in the US benefited, but there is a segment of the US population, 35 to 40%, which felt that they had lost out in that process. And therefore there is a reaction which US politics has to deal with, and as a result, globally, we all have to deal with that. So we have to see how that plays out. From the Indian point of view, we certainly benefited to some extent with the world order that was there. Especially post-1990, large number of people in India moved out of poverty. So with our engagement with trade and economic interaction and the globalization that was taking place, the digital technology sector in India did very well. It contributes almost $100 billion to India's exports, which is a very significant component, generates 7% of India's GDP, generates huge amount of high value addition in that sector. So we did benefit. But we did not become, one would argue, we didn't get a place at the table. And therefore, with the disruption that is happening, if there is going to be greater economic and political opportunity for India, that is something that India would need to look for and strive for. So I think that would be the approach.
Let me take 2 or 3 other people. Yes, Aditya, if you identify yourself.
Aditya Dave from Rusi. I think you briefly touched upon what I was going to ask, but my question was broadly about what the view is from both countries about the ideal state of the relationship between the US and India. So, and from the Indian perspective, it's about a balance between strategic autonomy and getting closer. And so what is it also from the US side, and whether there's a meeting of minds or whether there's some dissonance. So beyond specifics, just the general framework of the relationship itself.
Vipul?
Yes. I got brief comments. My name is Vipul Thakur, IISS member. Relationship between India and USA will to some extent depend on China, in the sense that more strong arm tactics China employs against India, India will have more incentive to be closer to USA. when it comes to S-400, discussions between Russia and India started prior to any laws passed in the USA, and of course other things you have already mentioned, sir, so I don't want to repeat. And when it comes to sanctions regarding Iran, India was justified in having confidence, because if USA imposed any sanctions on India, what would happen to the concept of India-Pacific? So I think India has some leverage there. Thank you.
Thank you. Do you know
One more we can take.
Viraj.
Right, thank you. Viraj Solanki, research analyst for South Asia at the Institute. I have two quick questions. One, firstly, you mentioned the Indo-Pacific. I was wondering if you could explain more about how you see India's engagement with the US going forward in the Indo-Pacific. And then you also discussed the Republic Day and Obama going for the Republic Day celebrations. I was wondering if you could talk a bit about what, if any, impact you think President Trump's rejection of the 2019 Republic Day invitation will have an impact on the relationship.
Thank you. So let me respond to these questions. One, on what would be the ideal state. In my mind, no two countries can have full convergence on foreign policy issues, because every country has its own interests, priorities, its own politics. Even the US and UK, which are seen as very close partners, don't have 100% convergence, if you look at what's happening with JCPOA, for example. So the ideal would be that analysts, policymakers, leaders in both countries understand that while there is convergence, while there is a lot of advantage in working together and work together where you can, there will be differences. And they handle those differences without sharpened rhetoric. And so I think if they're able to do that, there's a positive way forward. Because it's inevitable that, if India expects the US in a certain area to take some action. For example, in India, there could be disappointment related to how much pressure US is putting on Pakistan related to terrorism. And US will never be 100% able to meet India's expectations, because US has its own needs and dependence on Pakistan, particularly in relation to Afghanistan. Similarly, in the US, there's always an expectation that once we have decided to do something, all those that we work with, we support. How is it that they're not with us? So that difference will be there. But one area where there will be a challenge will be on economic issues. And you can see that right now the discussions between India and the US on economic issues are difficult. India's trade surplus with the US was about $25 billion. And especially when I was in government, I thought this was insignificant, because China was $350 billion. But President Trump's administration has decided that this is significant, that India is among the top 10 countries with which with US has a trade deficit, must be addressed. And there's a lot of pressure related to market access issues, intellectual property issues, and those are being discussed. The US, as you'd have seen, the recent notification 2 days ago, has withdrawn GSP from 95 products. 50 of those are being supplied by India. And under GSP, India has been exporting $5 billion worth to the US. The value is not much, but those come from the labor-intensive sector of the economy. Textiles, jewelry, leather. So there will be an impact on jobs. So there will be some negative reaction related to that. So there will be challenges, and so we'll have to learn how to build on the convergence, deal with the challenges. In terms of China, I think we should keep in mind that the relationship between India and China is not necessarily confrontational. There will be an element of competition, because even the US in its relationship with China has both cooperation and competition. There's a lot of cooperation, deep economic engagement. President Trump himself has said repeatedly that he sees China as an important partner in the context of North Korea. And then there are differences. Similarly, in India's case, we have an unresolved border. issue. There would be concerns related to how it is seen as China supporting some of Pakistan's negative orientations, which have an impact on India. But at the same time, there's a lot of cooperation. There have been high-level visits. The Indian Prime Minister was in Wuhan for an important informal summit with the Chinese President in April. A signal from both sides that despite the difficulties, the differences, they want to build on the positive in the relationship. And even from China's point of view, as it is assessed in India, that if China wants to expand its presence and its footprint, it must lower the intensity of the negative reactions from all countries, including India, and therefore approach India in a different context. And while US is our largest trading partner in goods and services, if you look just at goods, then China is India's largest trading partner, although it's an imbalanced trade. So it's a complex relationship, and I think India would attempt to approach it that way. In the context of the Indo-Pacific, I think for anybody who wants to see the full dimensions of India's policy, perhaps the best statement is the one made by the Indian Prime Minister on 1st June at Shangri-La dialogue on the Indo-Pacific, where he defines how India sees this area, India's role in it. And so the interesting dimension is that when US talks of the Indo-Pacific, it is looking at the western coast of India to the west coast of the United States, because that's the area of responsibility of the Indo-Pacific Command. Again, interestingly, when Australians talk of the Indo-Pacific, they look at the west coast of India to the west coast of the Pacific, because that puts Australia right in the center of things. When India talks of the Indo-Pacific, it looks at the east coast of Africa to the west coast of the United States, because the Indian Ocean is very much a part of India's strategic concern. And when Japan talks of the Indo-Pacific, it is also looking at east coast of Africa to west coast of the United States. So everybody is trying to factor in their interests, concerns as this new concept emerges. But within the framework of this concept, there are architectures of security that are being built and developed. We have the India-US bilateral relationship. We have a India-US discussions focusing just on the Indo-Pacific area. We have a India-US-Japan trilateral. We have the India-US-Japan trilateral military exercises, the Malabar exercises that are increasing in complexity. We have the India-US-Japan-Australia quadrilateral, which has been resumed but at a mid-official level so far, and we have to see how it evolves. We have a India-France-Australia trilateral, because as you can see, France is partly an Indian Ocean power with a presence in the Reunion Islands, and is also a Pacific power because New Caledonia, aside from others, has just voted to remain a part of France. So there is different dimensions, and everybody is also talking about ASEAN centrality in the Indo-Pacific, because it has to be an inclusive process, and the ASEAN countries, who again don't want to be compelled to make any kind of a choice between China and the others, but to be able to deal with everyone to maximize their interests. Therefore, they would look very much at the ASEAN centrality being a part of this process. So I think it is in this very, very complex set of relationships, security, architectures, networks of security that every major player is trying to define the dimensions of relationship here, because what everybody is seeing is the emergence of a new power in the region. China's GDP has increased, China's military strength has increased, China's presence in the Indian Ocean has increased, it has facilities in Djibouti, it is building capacities in Gwadar, it has a presence in Hambantota in Sri Lanka, it has a presence in Myanmar, China's influence with India's South Asian neighbors, Sri Lanka, Maldives, Nepal, all increasing. ASEAN is seeing a growing presence of China. China has built facilities in South China Sea. It is working on access and area denial for the US. Recently, they interdicted a US naval ship in that region. So with all this, everybody is basically having to deal with the consequences of a rising China, even if you don't get into any kind of a confrontation. And everybody is looking at what in the US is described as shaping the environment around the rise of China. So that's the sort of set of efforts in play, and that's how it will play out. In terms of President Trump not going for the... no, I don't think there will be too much of a reaction in India. Of course, if he had gone, that would be welcomed. But it was on the cards for some time now that he was unlikely to come, because the congressional elections are being held tomorrow, and there'll be a new Congress sworn in January, and there'll be a new speaker. So to do an adjustment at that time would have been more complicated. And that was not the case with President Obama. It was the final year of his presidency, so it was a different thing.
Thank you. We have time for the last set of 3 questions. So let me start in the order. I don't have a full list, so if you could identify yourself, please. Yes.
Hi, Shomnak.
Sure. Please.
Marie Curie Research Fellow at King's College London. Thank you for the very fascinating and insightful presentation, Ambassador. I have 2 questions. First, a specific. How do you expect US-India relations playing out in the context of India's inclusion in the NSG? And secondly, you talked about the consequences of China. And one of the areas where there might be a spillover in the future with the global uncertainties is outer space. And how do you see India figuring in that with the US-China dynamics there? Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Ronald Nash.
Ronald Nash, former British diplomat. Can I ask you about your very large diaspora and the extent to which you think it plays a role politically in the formation of this superpower relationship, if you like, between your 2 countries, or is it quiescent? Does the Indian diaspora settle down in America, become economically successful, become good Americans, and have little role on the relationship? What's the answer to that?
Thank you. Victoria.
Thank you. I just wondered, in your 4 factors, the second factor, of course, is how the US defines its relations with Pakistan, and you've mentioned how much pressure the US is prepared to put on Pakistan re terrorism. Could you just elaborate on what might negatively be affecting the relationship with India in terms of what the US does with Pakistan? And if I could just touch on an extra question, supposing that in terms of the sanctions on Iran, India can't make full potential of Chabahar, what might be India's fallback plan in the Persian Gulf?
Thank you, Victoria Schofield. Just for the purpose of the recording, if you respond to this.
Thank you. All, I think, very, very important questions, especially the one on diaspora requires a fairly complex answer we discuss. But on the NSG, so clearly US, as 2008 reflected, supports India's engagement with the NSG. It was the US which really sort of led in many ways the charge to get an NSG exemption for India for civil nuclear cooperation. And recently the US has advocated India's membership of the NSG. It was blocked by China. And that, again, I think is a reflection of where China has evolved between 2008 and 2018. In 2008, China was the last country to move out of India's way and allow the exemption to take place. And they were able to be persuaded by the United States to go ahead with the exemption that all others were agreeing in. In 2016, China decided not to move out of the way, and it felt it could block India on its own, which it did. So I think it's more a reflection of where China sees its own role today in the global context, and also its relationship with Pakistan, with India in that framework. So I think US clearly will be supportive. Now, on outer space, of course, as of now, India's position remains clear, opposed to any kind of militarization of outer space, and that's how they pursue. In the context of the diaspora, it's very interesting. So without making it too long, the first generation that went to the United States were focused entirely on setting a base within the United States. Getting the economic structures going, getting the family established, becoming economically comfortable, and they did not engage either with US politics or with the US-India relationship. And many of them used to later they developed into what was called the shoot and scoot relationship, that you got yourselves photographed with congressmen and senators, and then you moved away, did nothing else, and put up those photographs in your houses. But now they become contributors to campaigns, and they are also asking for their concerns to be addressed by their congressmen and senators. Starting with the time of the Obama administration, a large number of Indian Americans were part of the administration. And the head of US Aid was an Indian American, Raj Shah, and of course many other important positions. In the Trump administration, again, you find large number of Indian Americans in very key positions, including their present permanent representative to the United Nations, Nikki Haley, who is seen also as somebody with higher level ambitions. Till 2016, historically, only 3 Indian Americans had been elected to Congress over a period of time. In the 2016 elections, at one time, 5 Indian Americans are there in Congress. And now many are standing for Congress this time. So we have to see how it... So I think what has happened is that as the US-India relationship is evolving in a positive direction, they see a greater role for themselves in contributing to further development of this relationship. Also, initially when many of them moved away from India, India was seen as a poor, developing country facing a lot of challenges. Today, India is seen differently. And therefore, again, there is a positive orientation and opportunity for them to engage with India. Many US multinationals now setting up offices and establishments in India very often prefer to hire an Indian American to head those offices because they see there is an advantage in that connect and perhaps they can perform and deliver even better. So going ahead, I believe that the Indian origin community, which is going to get even more influential in the United States, will see advantage to itself in advocating for American interest in a deeper engagement with India. And I think on that basis, it will probably advance. In terms of the US-Pakistan relationship, so the way I see it and assess, especially after 9/11, the US has been conflicted. It has needed Pakistan to support the effort it is making in Afghanistan, because bulk of US supplies for its military go through Pakistan. There has also been an argument that if Pakistan works with the US, also in the political context, perhaps the resolution of the challenges in Afghanistan would become easier. At the same time, Pakistan has also, in fact, when I was there doing advocacy on behalf of India in the US, I used to say, which is the US best friend in Afghanistan? Which is the country that allows all your weapons to go through, supplies to go through for your forces? It's Pakistan. And which is your worst enemy in Afghanistan? Which is the country that has prevented you from achieving your objectives? Which is the country that had provided safe haven to terrorists that attack your troops? Which is the country that has funded, equipped, trained people who go out and kill US soldiers and prevent US achievement of objectives? It is Pakistan. And I think the dilemma for US policy is that its best friend is its worst enemy, and they have not been able to deal with that challenge. So I think in the context of Pakistan, US has to work out how much does it need Pakistan and to what extent is Pakistan thwarting its achieving its objectives. And so President Trump's policy announcement in August last year on South Asia, where he said that you cannot harbor terrorists and at the same time accept aid from the United States, was one reflection. His tweet on 1st January this year, cutting off aid to Pakistan, was another reflection. But today the US is again focusing on a reconciliation with the Taliban. And therefore, assessment would be that reconciliation with Taliban would require support from Pakistan. And therefore, I would anticipate that the pressure on Pakistan would ease as a result in the hope of reconciliation. So we have to watch. We have to see how it plays out. As I said earlier, in India, the assessment would be that reconciliation with Taliban is not going to work. And therefore, this policy that is being attempted is unlikely to succeed. The easing of pressure is not a good policy option to exercise. But the US will take its decisions based on its own assessments and interest. And people in India have to understand that and see how it plays out. And so we have to see how the new phase in the relationship with Pakistan plays out. On Chabahar, I think there is a recognition in the US of the importance of Chabahar in the context of Afghanistan. When the original US sanction was done, covering the 2012-15 period before JCPOA, there was a carve-out for Chabahar. And that supplies through Chabahar meant for Afghanistan were exempt from sanctions. So there was a recognition that Afghanistan also needed an alternative access to the sea beyond its dependence on Pakistan. Therefore, Chabahar for Afghanistan and for US interest was a useful engagement. So to that extent, I think that effort will continue. But clearly, in the current environment of uncertainty related to Iran sanctions, funding for projects would dry up. Ships wanting to go and dock at Chabahar would get more careful. And therefore, full realization of its potential will certainly get difficult going ahead.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Ambassador. We've run out of time, so we are going to end now. But I'd like to thank you very much for your incisive comments and perspectives on this important relationship, the most important relationship for India. I mean, I think you talked about a productive joint venture, maybe not 50-50 yet, but fairly sort of equal in that respect from the Indian side. I'd like all of you to join me in thanking Ambassador Singh.